Mr Chair.
The Honourable Hekia Parata.
Mr Chair, I'd really like to answer as comprehensively as possible the issue of equity that is being raised quite properly by members of the House. And that is to say that when the objectives provide for every child, each and every child reaching his or her potential, that is the equitable outcome that we are focused on. I agree with the member, Ms Martin, that children start at different points, but the whole point of this objective is, regardless of where children start from, there must be equitable outcomes for each and every one of them. And that is further buttressed in the bill by the references to what boards will be required to. It's on bill page 103. In new Schedule 6, boards' objectives in governing the schools includes that the boards must ensure that the school is inclusive of and caters for students with differing needs. So in different ways throughout the legislation, there is explicit requirement to get each child what they need for them to be successful, and that is the definition of equity that I am looking for, that they get the best results possible for themselves. On the matter of cohort entry, just recently raised by Ms Martin, first of all, I want to repeat that this is completely voluntary. Schools are not required to adopt cohort entry, but for those schools that wish to, they must consult, and after consultation can introduce it. Secondly, parents choosing to have cohort entry are not required to start their child at the age closest to their 5th birthday, but before it. They can choose exactly what the member is commending, after 5 or closest to their child turning 6, but certainly before they turn 6. So nothing about cohort entry is compulsive or prescriptive. But the evidence that we have from new entrant teachers is that it is, in their view, more effective for kids to start with a group and begin their transition from early learning and progress through their first and second terms together. And the third point I'd make, Mr Chair, is that New Zealand is alone in the countries we compare ourselves with to have continuous entry. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And I too want to talk about